Welcome to the series called The Spirituality of Wine and Reasons for the Faith. It's a story of my faith journey in the area of apologetics. Apologia in the Greek means to give a reason, to give a defense of the faith. You know, we have internal things that happen to us. Blaise Pascal said that the heart has reasons that the brain can't put into words. That's kind of paraphrasing him. But in addition to that, we have the external history of the Gospels, the credibility of the eyewitnesses and close associates of eyewitnesses. Well, lately, there's been a skeptical pushback to the claims of the apologists, the defenders of the Christian faith. So in this episode, I will be exploring this issue. Now, I've recently had my wisdom tooth pulled out, so I'm going to cheat a little bit. I am going to use my digital voice. Hopefully, it won't distract you too much because it tends to be on the serious side. But that's the way it is for today because I wanted to get this message out on looking at the evidence for the Christian faith. I came across a recent video from a skeptic by the name of Christopher Cornthwaite. He has a master's degree in divinity as well as a PhD in Christian origins. In reflecting on the arguments of skeptics, I'm reminded of a discussion back in 2009 in which the Christian philosopher Dallas Willard addressed doubt and belief, saying, quote, "If you're going to be a doubter, be sure to doubt your doubts as well as your beliefs," unquote. Willard critiqued cultural tendencies to prioritize skepticism over belief. Quote, "We live in a culture that has, for centuries now, cultivated the idea that the skeptical person is always smarter than one who believes. You can almost be as stupid as a cabbage as long as you doubt," unquote. Willard's critique of rigid skepticism is that he viewed it as just as obstinate as unreflective belief. In contrast to holding to rigid skepticism, Willard suggests one should have a balanced approach where beliefs are held with humility and openness to revision. In my own life, I've found that defending the Gospels is a process that blends passion, evidence, and faith. It's a journey I've pursued for 46 years. So, just as I learned winemaking through passion and practice, I've studied the Gospels with the same drive, trusting the historical evidence we're about to unpack. Let's get back to Cornthwaite's challenge and see how the Church Fathers answer it. Back to Christopher Cornthwaite. I don't know what he studied in the area of Christian origins and for how long, but in leaving both the ministry and the historic Christian faith, he has leveraged his expertise and knowledge in a newfound passion to promote the cause of being an influential apologist for post-Christian deconstructionism. Cornthwaite has recently put out a series of videos that make a strong case against the claims of historic Christianity. In his description on his video channel, among other things, he states how his agenda is to, quote, "hate apologetics and anything else that stops people from using their brains," unquote. A recent video of his had this provocative title, "We have no idea where the Gospels came from." Christopher joins his fellow skeptics in calling the evidence for the Gospels patchy and unreliable. But is that really true? Is Cornthwaite right that we have no idea where the Gospels came from? Are Christian apologists, as some skeptics suggest, failing to critically engage with the evidence for the Gospels being written by eyewitnesses or their close associates? To give Cornthwaite his due, his claim echoes scholars like Bart Ehrman, who argue that the Gospels' anonymity and decades of oral transmission create uncertainty. Ehrman, in books like Misquoting Jesus, suggests oral stories could change over time, like a game of telephone. But let's unpack this fairly. Ancient oral cultures, especially Jewish ones, were not like telephone games. Oral traditions in tightly knit communities, like those of early Christians, were often fixed in writing within 30-60 years of Jesus, a period short enough for eyewitnesses or their immediate followers to correct distortions. Scholars like Kenneth Bailey, who studied Middle Eastern oral traditions, show that communities tightly controlled stories about revered figures like Jesus by correcting errors through collective memory. Think of family recipes passed down unchanged. In this video, we'll dig into the historical evidence from early church fathers to show that the authenticating of the Gospel's traditional authorships, starting with Matthew, are far more solid than one might think. Let's uncover the truth together. Hit that subscribe button to follow along. The study of the early history around the time of the first few centuries of our common era has been a passion of mine for most of my life. Back in 1978, during my summer at Concordia University in Irvine, I had the opportunity to do some extensive reading through the church fathers of the first 4 centuries, as well as writings from Jewish tradition. In my youth, I was fascinated by how early writings like the Didache and others, composed in the early 2nd century, contain sayings which are not in the canonical Gospels we currently have, but appear to be oral memories or quotes from diverse books in the early church that we no longer have. For example, the Didache, likely written in the early 2nd century, appears to convey oral memories and quotes from lost texts. In one section, it contains a reference to a popular saying in the early church. Quote, "It has also been said, 'Let your alms sweat in your hands until you have discerned to whom you will give.'" Unquote. Another example is from Justin Martyr in his Dialogue with Trypho. Justin famously writes that there was a fire on the Jordan River at the time of Jesus' baptism. While this might be metaphorical, it could also have been meant to be taken as a passed-on oral memory, as it sounds similar to the visions, or perhaps literal fire-like phenomena occurring on the day of Pentecost. There is another fascinating reference from another early church writer about Jesus being born in a cave, suggesting a preserved oral memory. The list could go on, as there are many more extra-biblical quotes that can be found that appear to be connected with lost letters or oral memories dating back to the New Testament times. Being a confessional Lutheran, those sort of discoveries don't bother me, as I hold to what is called an open canon. That is to say, each recorded oral memory of the life and times of Jesus and his disciples needs to be weighed on its own merits, with both external and internal evidence factored in. I have actually done this in a couple of my previous videos, where I've defended some of the early church oral memories related to the demise of Judas, and also a prophecy of Jesus that is recorded by an early church father that is related to viticultural abundance in the new heavens and new earth. As Rod Rosenblatt, a Lutheran professor of mine, once said back in 1979, quote, "If we find an extra letter from the Apostle Paul, we will include it in the canon. If we find out the book of James is not apostolically authorized, we will dump it from the Bible. It's a question of epistemology." Unquote. That comment stuck with me in the expansive sense. I viewed these oral memories, or quotes from the early church fathers, as not competing, but complementing and illuminating the accepted New Testament canon that we have in our current Bibles. Since that time, for the past 46 years, I have studied those early church texts over and over again. I've done this in an in-depth manner, along with teaching church history utilizing insights from that learning process. With my classical Lutheran seminary educational background, and also being a history scholar, I believe the claim that the evidence for the Gospels is too patchy for certainty misrepresents how true scholars should study ancient history. Let's pause to address some skeptical views head-on, like those from Christopher Cornthwaite, who claims we have no idea where the Gospels came from. First, on authorship. It's true the Gospels don't explicitly name their authors within the narrative itself, which might suggest titles were added later to lend apostolic authority. However, this was common in ancient texts like Josephus' Jewish War, which also relies on external attribution for authentication. Skeptics might argue that Papyrus 1p1, a 2nd-3rd century fragment of Matthew, lacks a title, with its page number alpha at the top indicating no space for 1. This is used to claim that early Gospels were anonymous. However, P1's fragmentary nature limits its evidential weight. As Simon Gathercole notes, titles could appear on lost cover sheets, flyleaves, or tags, as seen in P4. The presence of titles in P4, P66, and P75 outweighs P1's silence, as no early manuscript attributes the Gospels to alternative authors. The practical need to distinguish multiple Gospels in early Christian communities further supports the use of titles from the outset. Church fathers, like Irenaeus, who studied under Polycarp, a hearer of John the Apostle, and Papias, who wrote within a century of Jesus, tie these texts to apostles or their close associates. Skeptics argue these claims reflect later ecclesiastical agendas to counter heresies, but their early dating and agreement across regions like Asia Minor, Rome, and Gaul suggest reliable historical memory, not mere invention. Next, let's talk oral tradition. Skeptics like Bart Ehrman argue that the Gospels were written decades after Jesus, relying on oral stories that could have changed. But oral cultures, particularly Jewish ones in New Testament times, prioritized accuracy through communal storytelling, as seen in the Mishnah's emphasis on precise memorization. Oral memories shared within a community provide the likelihood of constant correction. They are much more accurate than single stories passed on in a telephone game type situation. Think of a family recipe passed down for generations. The core stays the same because everyone checks it. That's how Jesus' disciples likely preserved his teachings. In legal settings today, Oral testimony remains crucial. Think of Holocaust survivor interviews. Think of first responders giving their account of a crime. Accuracy in human memory, especially when it's community checked, can be remarkably strong. To dig deeper, let's consider what scholars like Jan Vansina, an expert in oral history, have found. In his book, Oral Tradition as History, Vansina shows that oral cultures, like those in first century Israel, used communal storytelling to preserve accuracy, especially for revered figures. For instance, the Qumran community, known for the Dead Sea Scrolls, memorized texts with precision, a practice Jesus' disciples likely followed. Take the feeding of the 5,000 found in all four Gospels. Its consistency across accounts shows how tightly early Christians guarded their memories of. Jesus' skeptics may argue this reflects literary dependence, such as Mark being a source for Matthew and Luke, but the event's presence in John, an independent gospel, and the early dating of oral traditions within living memory suggests a shared eyewitness core, not mere copying. The Gospels were written within living memory of Jesus' life, and were drawing upon eyewitness accounts, as Papias suggests for Mark's link to Peter. This gives us confidence in their historical core. We will be examining what Papias says about Mark's link to Peter later on in this video. But what about textual variations? I've done a whole episode before on this issue. Skeptics like to highlight differences in manuscripts. However, as the textual critic expert, James Snap Jr., points out, while there are thousands of variations, mostly spelling or word order, the core events remain stable. James Snap estimates there are roughly 5,800 Greek manuscripts for the New Testament, though, to be sure, he acknowledges that early ones in the 2nd to 4th centuries, for example, P45, and the Codex Sinaiticus, are fewer and often fragmentary. But compare those roughly 5,800 Greek manuscripts for the New Testament to the 1,757 manuscripts that exist for Homer's Iliad, and the Gospel's evidence is overwhelming. Then there's the diversity of early Christian writings. Cornthwaite points to texts like the Gospel of Thomas, which include sayings not in our Gospels. While it is possible the Gospel of Thomas contains some authentic sayings of Jesus, it was not recognized by any of the early church leaders as apostolic. On the other hand, the canonical Gospels were quoted by recognized church leaders like Ignatius by the year 110, showing their early apostolic roots. The canonical Gospels stood out for their ties to apostles and widespread use. By around the year 110, Ignatius of Antioch quotes Matthew and Luke, and Justin Martyr, around the year 150, calls them Memoirs of the Apostles. The Muratorian fragment, around the year 170, confirms all four as authoritative, showing an early consensus. Finally, historians use specific criteria to test reliability. The criterion of embarrassment suggests events like Peter's denial or Jesus' baptism by John are historical, as they're unlikely to be invented. Skeptics might argue these reflect theological motifs, but their inclusion across multiple Gospels strengthens their historicity. Multiple attestation events in several Gospels, like the feeding of the 5,000, adds weight. Coherence with first-century Judea, like Roman crucifixion practices, further supports the Gospel's historicity. These points don't erase all doubts, as one could always claim that the authors were ahead of the time in writing historical fictional accounts like in our modern era, but they do show the traditional understanding of the Gospels rest on solid ground. To be clear, we don't have exhaustive first-century records for any ancient text. However, the early church fathers, like Irenaeus and Papias, give us a sufficient number of fragments that form a clear picture when pieced together. While not exhaustive, the fragments from church fathers like Irenaeus and Papias provide a compelling case for the Gospel's early origins. It's important to point out that in most of life, belief is a degreed proposition. We start each day not knowing, with absolute certainty, any number of things. For example, just walking across an intersection crosswalk will often involve a personal subjective belief that it is safe to do so. That is the case with the evidence of history. In some cases, we might have as low as a 65% subjective certainty on any given data point related to the reliability of various layered transmission vectors. But that subjective percentage can still give us a clear warrant for following through with what is clear for us at the time. It's the logical thing to do. As one legal scholar points out, most decisions in life are based upon hearsay evidence. Historical knowledge often involves probabilistic judgments, as seen in secular histories. For example, most scholars put their trust in what we have from Tacitus on what he says about Nero, even though it's possible that Nero was scapegoated or Tacitus amplified rumors. It is interesting to compare the transmission of the narratives and sayings of Jesus, who was called a rabbi by his followers, with Jewish tradition for other rabbis. In Jewish tradition, the transmission of teachings was highly valued and meticulously preserved. For example, the Mishnah emphasizes how accurate memory from the 1st century on was considered a virtue. As a case in point, Rabbi Zakkai described Rabbi Eliezer as, quote, a cemented cistern which does not lose a drop, unquote. In other words, in the early Jewish tradition, the ideal disciple should recall their rabbi's words, highlighting precision expected in oral transmission. This wasn't just Rabbi Eliezer's quirk. It reflected a broader 1st century commitment to accuracy, as seen in the Talmud, Eruvin 53, where Rabbi Yochanan praises students who repeat teachings exactly. He refers to Psalm 12, quote, those who repeat their teaching in the same words are praiseworthy, for it is written, the words of the Lord are pure words, unquote. This emphasis on precision was especially vital after the temple's destruction in the 1st century, when Roman oppression threatened Jewish tradition. Historical accounts like those from Josephus describe how rabbis like Yochanan ben Zakkai worked tirelessly to safeguard the oral Torah, prioritizing fidelity over embellishment to ensure Judaism's survival. In other words, in Jewish tradition, memory wasn't casual, it was sacred. There was an emphasis on how important accuracy was in memorizing a rabbi's teaching. By analogy, with their Jewish roots, the early disciples of Jesus would have likely had the same approach in recalling their master's teaching. Consistent testimonies from regions like Asia Minor to Gaul build a strong case for the gospel's reliability. Think of it like a puzzle. Each piece adds to a trustworthy whole. For example, in his Against Heresies, Book 3, Chapter 1, Irenaeus, around the year 180, says, quote, Matthew published his gospel among the Hebrews in their own dialect, while Peter and Paul were preaching at Rome, unquote. This early dating, within 30 years of Jesus' life, aligns with a rapid spread of Christian communities, as seen in the book of Acts, ensuring eyewitnesses shaped the Gospels. Frequent 1st century travel, like that of merchant Flavius Zeuxis, who sailed to Italy 72 times, makes Peter's presence in Rome plausible, whether around the year 42, as John Wenham suggests based on Acts 12, or closer to 60, as Raymond Brown argues from Paul's letters. Who was Flavius Zeuxis, you might ask? Zeuxis was a 1st century merchant from Hierapolis. He sailed 72 times to Italy around Cape Malea, as his tomb boasts, likely during Tiberius to Nero's reigns. If a merchant like Flavius Zeuxis sailed 72 times to Italy, Peter's travel to Rome, as Irenaeus suggests, is plausible. Back to Irenaeus, a 2nd century historian and Christian theologian. He writes about how, quote, Matthew published his gospel among the Hebrews in their own dialect, while Peter and Paul were preaching at Rome, unquote. In writing that way, Irenaeus is likely using the phrase, preaching at Rome, to mean the broader intermittent apostolic church planting era in that city that Peter, and later Paul, participated in. Papias, around the year 120, previously comments that Matthew compiled theologia in Hebrew. Papias' earliest testimony is meticulously preserved by the church father Eusebius in his Ecclesiastical History, Book 3, Chapter 39. Quote, Matthew put together the logia in the Hebrew dialect, and each one interpreted them as best he could, unquote. What is fascinating here to consider is that scholar Anthony Thistleton, in works like The Two Horizons, shows that the Greek word, often translated as interpreted, which in the Greek is the word, hermeneusse, isn't just about translating from Aramaic to Greek. It has a broader, multivalent, semantic range encompassing translation, explanation, and even contextual adaptation. The phrase by Papias, as best he could, further implies variability in skill and approach, encompassing both informal preaching and more formal interpretive efforts. So, early Christians, preachers, teachers, or scribes were actively sharing Matthew's logia through sermons, written translations, or worship rooted in Jewish traditions of precise memory, like Rabbi Eliezer's cemented cistern. It is important to point out that evidence from the Bible, Dead Sea Scrolls, Targums, New Testament, and Church Fathers shows Hebrew and Aramaic were used somewhat synonymously, especially by non-Jews. That being the case, Papias' mentioning of Jesus composing his logia in Hebrew could broadly denote a Jewish Semitic language or script, such as Aramaic, the dominant vernacular of the 1st century. It is also important to point out that while some scholars suggest the term logia should be translated as oracles or sayings like those contained in the Gnostic Gospel of Thomas, There are other ways of translating it. As scholars like Kittle's commentary affirm, the term logia most often possesses a broader semantic range than simply oracles or isolated sayings. The term could readily encompass a substantive collection of words and deeds foundational to the full narrative gospel that Irenaeus later knew. For example, under the article on logia, Gerhard Kittel writes, "It is just as clear and indisputable that in light of the usage of the LXX, New Testament and early Church, the more comprehensive meaning is also possible." Irenaeus, familiar with the established canonical Gospel of Matthew, likely interpreted Papias' earlier account through that developed lens, providing a harmonious continuity rather than a perceived discrepancy. This shows the organic growth and recognition of the Gospel. Irenaeus wasn't guessing about Matthew or others. He was a careful historian. As a case in point, in his work Against Heresies, Irenaeus tackled a textual variant in Revelation 13:18, which gives two versions for the Antichrist. One is the 666 number, and the other being the number 616. In his research, he claims to have checked the, quote, best and most ancient copies, unquote. He also adds how he factored in the recalling of his conversations when he was younger with eyewitnesses who knew John the Apostle. It is clear from those statements that as careful evaluator of early Christian texts, Irenaeus was a textual scholar who likely worked with manuscripts across multiple regions, such as Asia Minor, Lyons in the south of France, and also Rome. Irenaeus, around the year 180, notes that the Ebionites, a Jewish Christian sect, used a version of Matthew's Gospel in Hebrew, further attesting to its early Semitic roots despite their divergent beliefs. This can be found in his work Against Heresies 1, 26.2. Besides Papias and Irenaeus, other church fathers confirm Matthew's Hebrew roots. For example, Eusebius asserts that Eusebius, who lived from the years 110 to 180, adduces some things out of the Gospel according to the Hebrews. Then there is Jerome. He claimed in his work Against the Pelagians to have read a Gospel of the Hebrews. He considered it to be closely tied to Matthew's text and used it to clarify the meaning of such phrases as daily bread in the Greek. In his work, Lives of Illustrious Men, he referred to it as the work of the evangelist, thereby showing that he believed it was an authentic Aramaic precursor gospel to the Apostle Matthew's later Greek version. Skeptics claim the gospel to the Hebrews Nazarene used proves it's a late sectarian text, but Edward Nicholson argues in his 1879 book, The Gospel According to the Hebrews, that sects adopted early texts, not created them. The gospel to the Hebrews' simplicity and Eusebius' citation support its first-century origin. We longer have what Irenaeus and others were acquainted with. However, the absence of an early Hebrew manuscript from Matthew in all parts of the Roman Empire is not unusual, as most ancient texts survive only in translations or fragments, like the Septuagint's Hebrew originals. Another example would be how Josephus wrote his Jewish War originally in Aramaic and presented it to the Emperor Vespasian between the years 75 to 79. Yet, we only have it as a Greek translation in our modern era. Jerome, in his commentary on Matthew's prologue, notes that Matthew's Greek is polished like the Septuagint's book of Ecclesiastes, suggesting a refined translation from a Hebrew or Aramaic original. Some skeptics argue the Gospel of Matthew's polished Greek lacks Aramaic translation hints. They use this to make a case that this demands it was originally composed in Greek. But as Jerome noticed, the Septuagint, or LXX, shows otherwise. Books like Proverbs, the book of Ecclesiastes, Isaiah, and Deuteronomy were translated from Hebrew into elegant, idiomatic Greek, masking their Hebrew roots yet preserving their meaning. That's important to ponder as the Septuagint demonstrates that Hebrew texts can be translated into Greek with varying degrees of fidelity from literal, as can be observed in the book of Ecclesiastes, to that of a more free style, as can be observed in the book of Proverbs and also the book of Job. The book of Proverbs, for instance, paraphrases and stylizes the Hebrew to produce idiomatic Greek, often masking its origins. This can especially be seen in Proverbs chapter 1, with verse 7's philosophical tone. This is important, as a translator of a Hebrew Matthew into Greek could have edited the text to suit Greek-speaking audiences, smoothing out Semitic syntax and incorporating the Septuagint's phrasing for scriptural citations. In other words, Matthew's polished Greek could very easily reflect a high-quality process of translation and redaction, akin to the Septuagint's freer translations. That being said, despite its Greek style, Matthew retains Semitisms, for example, Son of Man idioms and Matthew 5:17's legal focus. These align with a potential Semitic source. These are subtler than the book of Ecclesiastes' literal Hebraisms, but comparable to the book of Proverbs' residual Semitic features. In other words, the absence of translation errors could reflect editorial skill, not original composition. In a multilingual first-century context, a Jewish Christian author or translator could have produced a Greek Matthew for Hellenistic audiences, deliberately minimizing Semitic awkwardness. Matthew's Greek, possibly translated by Matthew himself or a skilled scribe that he worked with, could have polished an Aramaic text, using Septuagint-like language to appeal to Jewish readers. If so, this aligns with what Papias likely means about the word logia. That is to say, the meaning of the word and how it's used in context suggests a substantive work underlying the formation of our Greek gospel. This is significant as it counters skepticism about its Hebrew origins. That being said, the translated edition of Matthew's Gospel in Greek likely involved the removal of certain accounts from the logia of Jesus that is in the Aramaic version of Matthew's Gospel. This would have been done to ensure theological clarity and consistency with an emphasis on kingdom ethics for a different cultural milieu, or perhaps to streamline the narrative for integration with other sources like Mark's Gospel. Practical considerations such as fitting the text within the length and constraints of a standard scroll for a new edition in Greek, or simply to align with a specific literary and theological vision for a broader audience, could also have played a role in excluding particular stories. Jerome is our most significant source for the Gospel of the Hebrews. Besides reading it, he also stated he copied it himself from the Nazarenes in Berea Aleppo, and he even translated it into Greek and Latin. Jerome explicitly identifies this text as the, quote, Gospel according to the Hebrews, which was written indeed in the Chaldees or Aramaic language, but in Hebrew characters, which the Nazarenes use as the Gospel of the Apostles, or as most people think according to Matthew, which also is contained in the library at Caesarea. Unquote. For this reference, see his book, On Illustrious Men. In his Ecclesiastical History, Book 5, Chapter 10, Eusebius around the year 325 writes about a fellow by the name Pantinus, who was head of the catechetical school in Alexandria in the 2nd century. He writes the following, quote, Pantinus is said to have gone to India. It is reported that among persons there who knew of Christ, he found the gospel according to Matthew, which had anticipated his own arrival. For Bartholomew, one of the apostles, had preached to them, and left with them the writing of Matthew in the Hebrew letters, and it was preserved till this time. Unquote. The Apostle Bartholomew likely preached from this Aramaic Matthew in India to Jewish residents there. Eusebius' account suggests a plausible transmission chain, with Bartholomew preaching Matthew's Gospel, Pantinus finding it around 150-180, and Jerome accessing it in Caesarea's library. While this lacks direct corroboration, it supports the early circulation of the Semitic Matthew, consistent with Irenaeus and Papias' testimony. Built by Origen around the years 184 to 253, and expanded by Pamphilus around the year 310, the library at Caesarea held manuscripts from Alexandria, where Pantinus taught from 150 to 180. After his India journey around the years 150 to 180, Pantinus likely brought this text to Alexandria, and copies reached Caesarea, where Jerome studied in the late 4th century. This links Bartholomew's preaching, Pantinus' find, and Jerome's text together in a logical transmission chain. With that being said, a strong Occam's razor-like argument could be made for our Greek version to be based upon what Papias writes about. The caveat being that the Greek translation evidently deviated from the Aramaic logia of Jesus with slight variations in the midst of undergoing a polished translation. In one example of such changes, Jerome quotes the Gospel to the Hebrews, or the original Aramaic version of Matthew's Gospel, as stating, And it happened when the Lord came up out of the water, the whole fountain of the Holy Spirit descended upon him and rested upon him, saying, My son, in all the prophets I was waiting for you, that you should come, and I might rest in you. For you are my rest. You are my first begotten Son, who reigns forever. While that sounds authentic, Jerome has another quote from the Gospel that personifies the Holy Spirit with maternal imagery, and that's a bit shocking to evangelical Christians. Although it's not that shocking for those in the Jewish tradition, and Origen and Jerome had no problems theologically with it. For example, Jerome writes in his commentary on Isaiah, quote, No one should be scandalized by this, since in Hebrew, spirit is in the feminine gender, while in our language, i.e., Latin, it is masculine, and in Greek it is neuter. There is no gender in the Godhead. Unquote. Those who are Star Trek fans may recall how Leonard Nimoy, in his 22 book, Shek Hai Na, portrays women as the feminine divine presence in Jewish tradition using bold imagery. This illustration from Nimoy's research can help us see that Jerome's quote from the Aramaic Gospel in mention the feminine aspect of the Holy Spirit is tied to the ancient Aramaic phrase for spirit, ruach, which is grammatically feminine. The reference Jerome quotes from in the Aramaic Gospel runs as follows. Jesus says, quote, "Just now my mother, the Holy Spirit, took me by one of my hairs and carried me to the great Mount Tabor." Unquote. Notice the poetic phrase, "took me by one of my hairs." It appears to be similar to that of Ezekiel 8 verse 3. It is a figurative reference depicting the Spirit's gentle nurturing divine guidance to Mount Tabor, a place where great revelations, like that of Jesus' transfiguration, took place. While Jewish Christians might embrace feminine imagery, Gentile converts, steeped in paganism, could misread it. I suspect that is why Matthew's Greek translation of his Gospel likely omitted the reference to the Holy Spirit as a feminine figure. It was to avoid associations with Greek female idol worship. This is not that unusual, as translators often adapted text to suit audiences. For example, the Septuagint in the 3rd century BC can be seen to have softened anthropomorphic language about God to avoid Greek philosophical objections. There is another fascinating aspect of the Aramaic Gospel of Matthew. In the book, Lives of Illustrious Men, chapter 3, Jerome provides a direct statement, quote, "In this it is to be noted that wherever the evangelist, whether on his own account or in the person of our Lord, the Savior quotes the testimony of the Old Testament, he does not follow the authority of the translators of the Septuagint, but the Hebrew." Unquote. It is important to point out that if Gospel to the Hebrews is the same as the original version of Matthew's Gospel, as Jerome thought, it is not conclusive proof that Jesus only quoted the Hebrew Old Testament at all times and in all places. The Aramaic version of Matthew's Gospel could have taken what Jesus said in Greek and translated it with the Hebrew Old Testament. On the other hand, even if Jesus did speak mostly in Aramaic, the Gospel writers could have used the LXX when translating his words into Greek, as it was readily available and familiar. For example, Greek translations of this text could have used the LXX for clarity, like modern translators adapt, for readability, the quote, "I came, I saw, I conquered." The Greek Matthew often quotes the LXX, like Parthenos, meaning virgin, in Matthew 1 verse 23 from Isaiah 7 verse 14. This could easily suggest translators polished Aramaic quotes to match the LXX, which was familiar to Greek-speaking Christians. Just as the LXX proverbs turned Hebrew into idiomatic Greek, a skilled translator could have adapted Matthew's original Aramaic version, ensuring theological clarity for a broader audience. It is also highly plausible that a bilingual author or translator, aware of the original Aramaic wordplay, could intentionally choose Greek words that semantically reproduce the spirit or meaning of even a pun, even if the phonetic wordplay or changes were lost in translation. The Peter and rock story from Matthew's Gospel is the strongest case for this type of intentional semantic preservation. Jerome further quoted various passages from this Gospel to the Hebrews in his commentaries, including a few more like a unique detail about the man with the withered hand, being a mason who prayed to Jesus for healing, a resurrection appearance to James, the brother of Jesus, before the other apostles. Jerome also confirms the presence of the episode of the woman caught in adultery, which was also in this gospel. He quotes the 3 words of Jesus, "Be trustworthy evaluators." It is a reference to how money changers tested coins to protect honest trade. The idea being we're encouraged to test the ideas, teachings, and influences we encounter to protect our faith. Then there is the fascinating account of Jerome's citation in commentary on Matthew on chapter 23, verse 35, where he explicitly corrects Matthew's Greek gospel reference to the son of Berecia to Matthew's gospel to the Hebrews' son of Jehoiada. This suggested he favored the Aramaic text version of Matthew's gospel for greater accuracy, despite the fact that Eusebius listed the Gospel of the Hebrews as a disputed book by some people in his Ecclesiastical History 3, 25.5. What is interesting in this regard is how Eusebius in his Ecclesiastical History mentions Papias, including a story about a woman accused of many sins before the Lord that Eusebius noted was found in the Gospel of the Hebrews. The simplest explanation for this is that the Gospel of the Hebrews that Eusebius mentioned was the same as the Logia of Jesus that Papias writes about. Jerome, in his work on Illustrious Men, chapter 16, states that Ignatius of Antioch, a 2nd century bishop, wrote to the Smyrnians around the year 110. Ignatius, he says, quote, bore witness to the gospel which I have recently translated, in respect of the person of Christ, saying, I indeed saw him in the flesh after the resurrection, and I believe that he is. And when he came to Peter, and those who were with Peter, he said to them, Behold, touch me and see me, how that I am not an incorporeal spirit. And straightway they touched him and believed." Unquote. Given that he had recently translated this text, it is reasonable to assume Jerome would have had a precise memory of its contents. This section was likely not included in Matthew's Greek version of his gospel, as it appears to be very similar to Luke chapter 24, verse 39. But what about the Gospel of Mark? Here it's even more interesting. Eusebius, in his chronicle as preserved in Jerome Latin translation and Armenian versions, places the writing of Mark's gospel in the 3rd year of Claudius, which aligns with the years 43 to 44, since Claudius became emperor in January of the year 41, following Caligula's assassination. Mark's Gospel, per Eusebius, dates to the years 43 to 44, which is then tied to Peter's preaching. Papias, an early Christian bishop of Hierapolis, writing around 100-130, is also cited by Eusebius in his Ecclesiastical History, Book Roman 3, chapter 39, in regards to the origins of the Gospel of Mark. According to Eusebius, Papias stated, quote, Mark, having become the interpreter of Peter, wrote down accurately, though not in order, whatsoever he remembered of the things said or done by Christ. For he neither heard the Lord nor followed him, but afterward, as I said, he followed Peter, who adapted his teaching to the needs of his hearers, but with no intention of giving a connected account of the Lord's discourses. Unquote. What Papias writes about John Mark and how he neither heard the Lord nor followed him is likely a broad reference to how Mark was not one of the regular learning disciples of Jesus. That nuanced distinction is important in that it is interesting how in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 14, there is an inclusion of a minor detail of a young man fleeing, which suggests that an eyewitness like John Mark himself, reflecting on his childhood, is writing the narrative. Notice also that Papias explains that Mark was accurately recording Peter's preaching, and Peter, quote, adapted his teachings to the needs of his hearers, but not as though he were drawing up a connected account of the Lord's discourses, unquote. In other words, Peter presented teachings and stories as occasion demanded, not as a continuous biography. Mark faithfully reproduced this. Papias is referring to the concept of a rhetorical arrangement, that is, quote, not in order, unquote. That is because it skips over major sections of the life and ministry of Jesus, especially that of Jesus' early years. Papias is also explaining why Mark is concise and vivid. Mark's gospel often jumps rapidly from scene to scene. For example, he uses the word immediately over 40 times and prioritizes impactful episodes and themes over strict chronological or an exhaustive biographical coverage. Peter's preaching was dynamic and situation-specific, that is ad hoc, not a linear biography. Mark faithfully captured this. Papias' account links Mark's unique style directly to Peter's spontaneous preaching. It explains why Mark differs from the more organized narrative of Luke or the thematically structured Matthew. Clement of Alexandria, as cited by Cassiodorus in his Latin excerpt from Clement on 1 Peter 5:13, and also Eusebius in his Ecclesiastical History recounts, quote, Mark, a follower of Peter, while Peter was preaching the gospel publicly in Rome in the presence of certain of Caesar's equestrians and was putting forward many testimonies about Christ, was requested by them to record what had been said, and he did so and gave them the gospel to read. Unquote. In other words, the Gospel of Mark was composed in Rome at the urging of the equestrians, or what were called equites. They were an elite class of legally trained Roman knights who sought a written record of the Apostle Peter's Spirit-inspired preaching. This fits it with how Mark, Peter's longtime companion, likely took shorthand notes and crafted a concise, action-driven gospel rooted in Peter's oral teachings, as can be linked to 1 Peter 5, verse 13. The Gospel's direct style, emphasis on Jesus' authority, use of Latinisms, such as denarius and centurion, along with explanations of Jewish customs, and a focus on sacrificial discipleship, all align with the equities' practical, authoritative, and Roman cultural sensibilities. This confirms Clement's claim. These features, supported by early sources like Papias and Irenaeus, suggest Mark tailored his gospel for this influential audience, preserving Peter's testimony in a form suited for their administrative mindset and the challenges of early Christianity in Rome. The equites, as military and administrative elites, respected authority and decisive action. Mark's portrayal of Jesus as a figure of divine power and leadership would resonate with their cultural values, which prioritize strong governance and order. The legal training of the Equites would also make them attuned to Jesus' debates with religious leaders, for example, Mark 2:23-3, 6, which resemble legal disputes over authority and precedent. As Roman elites immersed in the empire's culture, the Equites would likely have limited knowledge of Jewish traditions, making Mark's explanatory asides necessary. The use of Latin terms and references to Roman institutions, for example, the centurion's confession at the cross, "Truly this man was the Son of God," Mark 15:39, would resonate with their cultural context, grounding the narrative in familiar terms. Their legal training would also make them attentive to the trial scenes, which depict Roman judicial authority interacting with Jesus' claims. The weaving in of Homeric parallels and rhetorical flourishes that John Mark, with his affluent Hellenized background, would have helped Peter in crafting his message in a form appealing to a Hellenized audience, including the Equites. So far we have uncovered how early church fathers built a strong case for the Gospel's reliability. But how did these books become the New Testament we know today? Here it is important to note that Jerome, in the 4th century, had access to extensive ancient sources that are no longer extant. He wrote in his De Viris Illustribus that John, the last living apostle, approved of the history of the deeds in the synoptic Gospels Matthew, Mark, and Luke, before writing his own Gospel to complete the narrative. Eusebius, who lived between the years 270 to 340, also writes in his Ecclesiastical History, Book 3, Chapter 24, about the Church's view of the synoptic Gospels being a true rendition of the life and sayings of Jesus. He also cites Clement of Alexandria, around the year 200, who claims Matthew and Luke, with their genealogies, were written first, supporting their early composition, although, to be sure, as I see it, there could have been subsequent editions that were updated for contextual reasons. While many modern scholars argue Mark was a literary source for Luke's Gospel, this remains a hypothesis, not a settled fact, and Clement's testimony aligns with apostolic tradition for early dating. Using an indefinite plural for emphasis on the phrase, they say, Eusebius states, quote, "Matthew preached earlier to Hebrews, when he was about to go to others also, committing his gospel to writing in his native tongue. John, who the whole time had made use of unwritten preaching, finally resorted to writing for the following reason. When the 3 previously written gospels had already been delivered to all and to him, they say that he accepted them, testifying to their truth." Unquote. It is likely that Eusebius was drawing upon the missing works of Papias, who quotes those who knew John, to establish the claim that John put his stamp of approval on the previously written Gospels. This wasn't a formal council like we might imagine today, but it was a natural act of authority. As an eyewitness to Jesus' life, John's approval carried immense weight, ensuring these texts were trustworthy. Imagine the last person who knew Jesus personally signing off on these accounts. That's the kind of credibility we're talking about. This apostolic oversight, starting in the 1st century, confirms the Gospel's reliability long before later councils, countering claims of a chaotic process. By the late 2nd century, we see the Gospels being recognized as a set. The Muratorian fragment, one of the earliest known canonical lists, confirms all 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, as authoritative. Though it's incomplete, the Muratorian fragment, or canon, as it's often called, from around the year 170, emphasizes John's eyewitness, quoting his own words from his epistle. Quote, "What we have seen with our eyes, heard with our ears, and touched with our hands, that we have written." Unquote. This shows the early church valued texts tied directly to apostles or their close associates, countering claims that the canon formed chaotically during a patchy period. The formation of the Gospels wasn't a random process. It fits a theological pattern. In the Old Testament times, Ezra, who was both a prophet and priest, played a key role in finalizing the canon. John, as the last apostle with a Levitical background, likely saw himself as God's instrument, much like Ezra. John helped to guide the New Testament's final shape. The early Christian community saw John as more than just an apostle. Polycrates, a prominent 2nd century bishop, described John as, quote, "a priest wearing the mitre." Unquote. That's a powerful image, whether literal or symbolic, of John's unique authority. This perception underscores John's role in overseeing the canon's formation, much like a high priest guiding sacred texts. Combined with the consistent historical testimony from figures like Jerome and the Muratorian fragment, this points to how the early church likely perceived what he did as a divinely guided process, not a chaotic one, despite the so-called patchy nature of ancient records. It should be pointed out that secular historians like Tacitus also rely on oral sources, yet we trust them. The Fathers' consistency, like Irenaeus citing John's disciples, strengthens their credibility. This early, widespread consensus, emerging within decades of the Gospel's composition, carries significant weight compared to modern hypotheses that rely on later textual analysis. Critical scholars like Bart Ehrman argue these traditions are secondary, but their consistency across diverse regions, like North Africa, Asia Minor, and Rome, suggests a reliable historical memory, not mere ecclesiastical invention. Here are a few more extra thoughts of mine to finish with for this video. Matthew and Luke contain significant unique material, demonstrating independent contributions. Matthew's Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5:7 and fulfillment citations in Matthew 1:22-23 reflect an eyewitness's Jewish perspective. Luke's infancy narrative in chapters 1 through 2 and parables, for example, Good Samaritan in Luke 10:25-37, show historical and theological depth consistent with the meticulous historian consulting eyewitnesses. That being said, it should be pointed out that the translation of Greek Matthew could have repeated various parts of Mark, or memorized units of Peter's preaching on purpose. If so, it would be akin to endorsing a trusted apostolic source, not derivative copying. It would be like how Bartholomew, one of the early apostles, used the text of Aramaic Matthew to preach to those in India. Simon Greenleaf, who was a 19th century expert in the field of legal reasoning and the rule of evidence, wrote a book called The Testimony of the Evangelists. Greenleaf's book was published in 1846. In the book, he uses his knowledge as a legal expert to argue that the Gospel's complementary details withstand legal scrutiny, supporting their independent yet harmonious witness. He argued that having independent witness testimonies in a courtroom actually strengthens their credibility. Arguing against the German higher critics of his day, Greenleaf used legal reason to demonstrate that variations between the Gospels reflect authenticity, not contradiction. Now for some other thoughts, to clarify and expand upon what was just presented. Eusebius, in his Ecclesiastical History 3.24, reports that John lived in Ephesus until the reign of Trajan, around the year 98, overseeing churches in Asia Minor. Our timeline shows John's Gospel, written around years 90 to 95, as the final Gospel, complementing Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Irenaeus, in his work, Against Heresies, Book 3, Chapter 1, says John wrote to counter heresies like Cerinthus, grounding his Gospel in apostolic eyewitness testimony. Why John? As Jesus' beloved disciple, his longevity and direct connection to Christ gave him unmatched credibility to guide the Greek canon's formation. This wasn't a late process. John's oversight began in the 1st century, building on the apostolic foundation that was mentioned earlier on in regards to Peter's travels. Our map shows Christian hubs like Antioch, Ephesus, and Rome by around the year 100, where Gospels were copied and used in worship. Ignatius of Antioch, around 110, quotes Matthew and Luke in his letters, showing their use in Syria. Justin Martyr, a 2nd century Christian apologist, describes Christian worship in Rome around the year 150, where memoirs of the apostles or the writings of the prophets were read aloud. The plural memoirs and their regular use suggest a collection consistent with the 4 Gospels being read together in early churches. For example, in his Dialogue with Trypho 106.3, Justin quotes a detail about Jesus' nickname for the sons of Zebedee, James and John, as Boanerges, meaning sons of thunder. This appears to be a clear reference to Mark 3:17, as he attributes this to the memoirs of the apostles. While skeptics like to appeal to how Justin writes about what he calls the Gospel of Peter to argue that Justin was working with an independent gospel, Justin is more likely referring to Peter's gospel memoirs that John Mark wrote down. That's because we have no evidence of Justin having any docetic tendencies, which the Gospel of Peter that we've recently found is saturated with. Justin also quotes or alludes to Matthew, especially the Sermon on the Mount, for example, Matthew 5:28 in First Apology 15.1, and the Nativity narrative, for example, Matthew 1:18-23 in his work, Dialogue with Trypho 78. Justin also references in his work, Dialogue with Trypho, unique Lucan material, such as the Annunciation contained in Luke 1:26-38 and how Jesus sweat like blood found in Luke 22:44. These suggest familiarity with Luke. In regard to the Gospel of John, Justin explicitly references the logos found in John 1:14 in First Apology 46 and Second Apology 6. He also alludes to John chapter 3, being born again, in his First Apology 61. These indicate knowledge of John's Gospel. Justin's student, by the name of Tatian, wrote a harmony of the 4 Greek Gospels. This also points to how Justin, for the most part, was likely already working with the 4 Gospels we know today. By 180, Irenaeus, in Against Heresies, Book 3, Chapter 11, defended the 4 Gospels as a unified set, comparing them to the 4 winds. This wasn't a top-down decision, but organic recognition, driven by apostolic origins. Skeptics often claim the New Testament canon was a late, arbitrary choice, pointing to competing texts like the Gospel of Thomas, or how it took centuries for the church councils to come to a conclusion on which books to have in the Greek canon. But this oversimplifies a complex but deliberate process. Texts like the Gospel of Thomas, emerging around the year 150, may preserve some authentic sayings, but lack the historical narrative and apostolic ties of the canonical Gospels, which were cited by leaders like Ignatius by around the year 110. Early Christians debated texts like the Gospel of Peter with docetic tendencies, but prioritized those with apostolic authority and widespread use, as seen in Irenaeus' defense of the 4 Gospels. Skeptics also argue the canon wasn't fixed until the Council of Carthage in 397. However, this council formalized the developing consensus. It was not a situation of chaos in the early church regarding which books should be included as apostolically authorized. The delay in consensus was due to the rigorous process ensuring reliability. It was not an arbitrary process. John's oversight, as Eusebius records as an historian, ensured only Gospels tied to apostles were accepted, countering forgeries and heresies. Earlier in the video, I touched upon how skeptics argue that the Gospels were originally anonymous, with attribution tags added later. However, ancient manuscripts, like those of Homer's Iliad or Tacitus' Annals, rarely include internal author names, but carry external titles, a standard practice mirrored in the Gospels. While placement and wording of attribution tags vary, their consistency in identifying Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John across diverse regions, in such places as Egypt, Asia Minor, and Rome, indicates a stable tradition. Martin Hengel argues that such variations are typical in ancient manuscripts, like those of Philo or Josephus, where titles were adapted for codex formats, but retained core authorial claims. Ancient texts often lacked internal author names, but were identified by external titles, as Martin Hengel argues. This was standard practice, as seen in works like Tacitus' Annals, which also rely on external attribution. In conclusion, while skeptics like Christopher Cornthwaite claim we have no idea where the Gospels came from, the evidence tells a different story. From church fathers like Irenaeus, Papias, and others, a consistent witness emerges. The Gospels were written by apostles or their close associates, preserved with care and proclaimed with conviction. These aren't fictional stories, they're anchored testimonies, living witnesses to the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. As we consider the preponderance of evidence, perhaps not as exhaustive as we would like, but certainly sufficient, our faith stands not on wishful thinking, but on historically grounded trust. So, stay with me on this journey. Let's continue to seek truth together and uncork the good news that's been transforming lives for 2,000 years. Be sure to subscribe for more apologetics insights.